My name's Kelly Fagan Robinson. I'm a social anthropologist in the Department of Social Anthropology here at Cambridge. My work tends to look at the breakdown between the individual and institutions in terms of communication. Now, traditionally, this has been within spaces of disability or different kinds of neurodiversities or alterabilities that impede the ability to be understood by other people. And it's not because this is necessarily a problem of the body, but rather a problem of incommensurabilities. So in my research, when I look at how individuals are dealt with by institutions, I look at the kinds of ways that the odds are stacked on both sides in different ways. So for example, two people could say disability and mean fundamentally different things depending on what their experience has been. If you are a person who's experienced disability your entire life, if you're a person who has experienced disability and disadvantage as a result of that disability, you will have a very different understanding of what disability means compared to typically an able-bodied, so-called able-bodied person who has no experience of disability. So that is what's actually happening. And it presents as empathy breakdown, but I think there's something more, and that's where ethnography comes in. My work over the last couple of years, which I'll talk about in the formal introduction in just a second, has shifted from these disability spaces into broader institutional contexts. So the front line of public support, looking at how people apply for these spaces. And more recently, in the last 2.5 years, I've turned my attention to children in schools. And that's fundamentally because of what we know as the really intense crisis that many of our young people are facing at this point. We know that 1.7 million children plus, and the plus is really quite a key part of this, were absent from schools last year. And many of those young people have been proven to have been absent as a result of mental distress, trauma, and other problems in their young lives that are as yet unresolved. We also know that there are another 100,000 plus, which is again a number that is picked from the air because most professionals agree that it's probably significantly higher, have dropped off the roll entirely. And these young people are perceived to be at seriously vulnerable and at serious disadvantage in terms of being able to be supported. Now, some of those people will have just moved during COVID, and that because they're in a different borough council, they're suddenly not visible in the same way. But many of them will be at risk of domestic violence, trafficking, and other severe vulnerabilities. So what we're talking about is not sort of this abstracted idea of what it is in people's lives that's happening. It's happening. We can see it happening. And we can see it happening beyond disadvantage, but it is disproportionately worse when we're talking about people from areas of multiple indices of deprivation. And that is where I've been focusing my time. In schools where the inequalities are so severely polarized that actually it becomes almost laughable that anyone could think that just by going to school, you'll have the same life chances. And this is the rhetoric that many of our young people have been hearing for a very long time. When we have a conversation about politics as written now, especially as we approach an election year, this is even more pressing. This is even more pressing because these young people are not just children who would be nice to help because they're cute and they're young, or because they're disadvantaged, or because it's a nice thing to do. These are the young people who, in a very short period of time, will be the voters. And how we treat people now will determine their engagement in the process, will determine their understanding of what voice they have in the conversation. And this is why we're talking about this. I had an image that I wanted to show you. It's downstairs, actually. So hopefully some of you can stay for the opening of the exhibition afterwards. But the image is an image of a broken window. And I wanted to show you this image because it really speaks to a lot of what's happening downstairs in the exhibition that we have and up here as well, but also what I've been seeing with young people in schools. So the image is a broken window. That is a shattered window from the municipal offices of 222 Upper Street, which is the center of Islington's local government. And 222 Upper Street also has Citizens Vice in it. It has a lot of frontline access for people who need support. But 222 Upper Street during COVID also became the municipal courts, where many people were being dealt with in terms of the judiciary. And that became a very fraught space because they were no longer going in just for support. They were also going in for adjudication. which shifted their relationship with that building. At some point, someone clearly got frustrated because every single window on the external building was shattered. I can show you an image of it. It's not as impressive as showing it writ large, but you can see it downstairs anyway. This was one of the windows. And the reason that I think this is interesting is because there are viewers at home. This is interesting to me because I know that when my children were frustrated or struggling during isolation, during COVID, they had many advantages in their young lives, but they did come to some challenging moments. My son, who has neurodiversities, particularly, they would go out and step on the frozen puddles outside, smashing them and maybe not talking to us, but exerting some kind of effect on the world. And it made me think of that when I saw this glass. It also made me think of it when Samuel, who was a young person I was working with at a secondary school in Islington, drew a beautiful picture on the back of an exercise we were doing in class. And when I complimented him on that picture, he wasn't very impressed with the compliment. And over the rest of the course of the class, he defaced his drawing in red pen with guns and inappropriate writing, angry writing, and just basically destroyed it. Now, to me, that is not communication. And this is what we are talking about today. The ability for young people to be seen, to be listened to, and to know that their voices are actually exerting some kind of pressure on the world, some kind of imprint, some impact. And so that is my vantage within this conversation. I'd like to introduce you to the panelists that I have to my right. It is a very diverse and wonderful group of people. Thank you. Come on in. I will do it in order on the sheet, although they'll be speaking in a slightly different order, so bear with me. So first we have Zerae Tucker. Zerae Tucker is a No More Red youth champion and secondary school student. He's a young person who lives in North London. He's the youngest participant of the ABC No More Red project. And he said that he feels that education improves your knowledge about facts, the current education system, and that it doesn't always fit everyone and isn't always fair. We have Professor Sean Lazar, who is the head of department here at Cambridge in social anthropology. She's also the author of 2 books on citizenship and collective politics in Latin America, El Alto, Rebel City, about Bolivia, and The Social Life of Politics about Argentina, and more recently, How We Struggle, a Political Anthropology of Labor. Alicia Donovan, who, apart from being a fantastic qualified social worker who works in Hackney, is also the mother of Zerae. She is of Caribbean and Irish heritage, a mother of 2, and identifies as a Black female woman. She enjoys traveling, reading, and used to play basketball, which awarded her the fortune of studying abroad. She describes herself as an advocate and is determined to be part of social change. She is unapologetic about challenging existing narratives and knows her voice and perspective is invaluable in driving that social change and promoting equity and justice. Rosie Jones McVeigh, who's a Wellcome Fellow at Exeter University, a social anthropologist who researches the way people think about one another's minds. This research has included the moral and political aspects of horse training, alternative education for young people, and animal-assisted therapies. Rosie's current research project is funded by the Wellcome Trust and investigates that challenging moral terrain of green social prescribing. We also have Larib Nayaz, a research associate from the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge, where she focuses on the evaluation of inclusive education interventions. She is also an inclusive education consultant in the Education Global Practice of the World Bank. She completed her PhD within the IOE, the Institute of Education at University College London, where her research focused on the role of religion in schools in Pakistan. Her research interests lie in the area of inclusion and exclusion in education, with a particular focus on gender, disability, and religion. Alex Parton Turner is a 20-year-old first year studying political science at Clare College. He grew up in Peckham, South London, and is interested in youth policy due to experiences with violent crime in his local area and school. Apologies, Alex, and thank you for being here. Lindsay Roberts Egan is now in her second local government chief executive role, first leading the London Borough of Islington, which is where we first worked together, and now leading the London Borough of Waltham Forest. She's held several senior strategic roles at local authority level, including Statutory Director of Children's Services and Statutory Director of Adult Services. Before local government, Lindsay was first a teacher, then a Special Educational Needs Coordinating Officer, or SENCO. You may hear us talk about that in a moment, supporting children and young people with additional needs. She went on to become a head teacher. She cites one of her most rewarding experiences as being head of both a primary and secondary pupil referral unit, where she further developed her approach to relational leadership. Now that I've introduced all of our speakers, I'm going to hand over the platform. Just to explain to everyone in the room again, as soon as we finish our 5-minute qualifications, we're going to turn over to you. And we really encourage you to get involved in this conversation. I know a lot of the people in this room, and I know how invested you are in this conversation and in the things that we might be able to do to act on it. So please do bring that to the table today. And also at home, please do put your questions in the chat. I'm going to have Zaray speak first, and then we'll turn over to Sean Lazar to start off the panel. That's all right.
My name is Ron. I just want to talk about school education. And I think sometimes it's a bit unfair. Like people with disabilities, sometimes they get treated differently. Like in my school, some people with disabilities get taken out of class and don't get their full education that other people get. So I think we can maybe change that. And one way, instead of taking them out, just teach them in the classroom with other students.
Great. Well, do you want to tell them a little bit about No More Red?
Yeah, I like No More Red because it helped me learn about courage and how to take good photos. So now in school, I feel more courageous to talk to my friends or speak in front of a classroom.
Can I help you with that one as well? So No More Red was a program that was run by Arsenal and Adidas. It was a voluntary opportunity for young people to go and try something new, to take them out of their usual spaces. And they had to have a love of Arsenal, so it was a little bit biased. But luckily, Zaray did actually qualify on that count and on many others besides. But No More Red is about addressing violent crime in the streets of Islington and beyond, right? And you guys did a photo project. Can you tell them a little bit about the photo project?
So basically, we went around to all our colleagues' houses and took photos, and they would explain stories about when I was younger, like Leon. He was explaining how he used to run down with his friends and do graffiti, well, not graffiti, draw on the brick walls. And yeah.
And you made recommendations for changing things too.
For example, just having more safety barriers and stuff, so kids don't get hurt as much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Thank you so much for speaking. That's brilliant. I'll turn over to Sean Lazar.
Do you want to come over there?
If you would, just because of the time, Sean.
Thank you. I wrote something down because I was a bit worried that I would just go on and talk for way too long, and I want to don't want to do that. So please forgive me for largely reading it out, otherwise it will just take forever. And what I want to do is, I've been thinking about citizenship and how we can think about citizenship and democratic citizenship. But I've got this idea of a relatively expansive notion of citizenship as way beyond voting. I want to underline that. As practices of political belonging in all sorts of different ways, and they vary in different ways in different places. And as I said, it should go well beyond voting, especially if we're talking about a democratic society. So this idea of practice also means that citizenship is about the creation of citizens. We might think of a desire for active citizens, but some places might desire quite passive citizens. Ideally, we'd be active citizens with the capacity.
Okay. I'm for now end of May actually, because it's just.
Sorry.
Has somebody got the?
Everybody should be, isn't it?
Oh, how peculiar. Anyway, I'm going to keep talking and to act and participate in government, but also to define what government means, not just enough to participate in something that's kind of set up for us. That's what I see as democratic citizenship. So creation of citizens is also an educational matter. In fact, citizenship has been thought of as about the education of particular kinds of political persons or selves in Western political thought, right back to Aristotle. The UK government has been interested in citizenship education one way or another for over 25 years now, at least, and that's how long I've been kind of thinking about it. So my impression, though, is that UK school education for citizenship retains quite a focus on the content of citizenship, what we might think of as content. That's to say, knowledge of rights and obligations, institutions, a kind of national knowledge of history and literature, language competency, etc. What I want to think about is what we might consider the embodied aspects and forms of citizenship that we're teaching or that we could teach. To illustrate this, I want to give you a flavour of how I think citizenship is taught in Bolivian schools, drawing on my experience in a school in El Alto some time ago. I have to confess it's quite a long time ago. I'm not going to say how long, but I do have a student who worked in a school elsewhere in Bolivia in 2020, and it doesn't seem to have changed too much, at least not in some key respects. Okay, so again, embodied citizenship is, I think, embodied political action and participation in our government. And so in El Alto, embodied citizenship, this is in Bolivia, city in Bolivia, embodied citizenship is experienced and taught as quite vertical forms of political agency. Might want to think about it as a pyramid with kind of leaders or teachers at the top and a base at the bottom. But the leaders do not just represent the base. In fact, the base, most people, are crucial to political action in various ways. And the important point I want to make here is that vertical or hierarchical forms of agency, the triangle, are not actually necessarily undemocratic. In fact, the leaders are accountable to the base in ways that I think isn't always the case in other systems, other political systems, including here. So in schools in Bolivia, hierarchical relationships between teachers and students can really be seen in lessons, where there's still quite a big emphasis on dictation, on a banking model of education, where the teacher is depositing knowledge with the students, just like Zoe was talking about to some extent. But these also coincide with a remarkably collective form of action. And there are two ways that I want to talk about. One is this thing called horas cívicas. They are like school assemblies. They're held quite frequently, and they're held on important dates for the neighbourhood, the city, the county, the department, and the country, to commemorate historical processes and important days like the Day of the Teacher, that sort of thing. The whole school attends. They can take most of a morning. They might include poems, speeches, dances, songs, or plays. Now, for a subset of those important dates, especially the Independence Days, the Hora Cívica shades until it becomes a civic parade. And that's when school children they parade, a bit like a kind of military parade. This models adult agency as adults also parade on key dates. So the school kids are doing what adults do on the Independence Day for the city. Now, adult civic parades are very similar in form to two other forms of collective political action, the dance procession and the street demonstration. And street demonstrations in particular are a very powerful form of collective agency, in part because of their similarity to the kind of civic parades and the dances. So the mass street demo is actually what impelled presidents to resign in 2003 and 2019 and brought others to power. But at a smaller scale, they're also what impelled changes in government and in legislation. They're part of the dynamic of government at a local level. So returning to the school, this came together in the demonstration that teachers organised for Children's Rights Week in the school that I worked in. It was combined with an hora cívica, a kind of school assembly, but then the pupils marched around their neighbourhood asserting their rights. This is because for the teachers, a street demonstration was the most obvious way to make children's rights substantive and to teach rights to children. So we might want to consider here the kind of voice that emerged. It's a collective, organised, structured, but very bottom-up voice. This is the voicing of the collective slogan shouted at a demonstration. It's a little bit different to the voicing of the spokesperson or the representative. So although my examples have been quite brief, hopefully they give a flavour of some of the kinds of embodied citizenship I saw in the school in El Alto, Bolivia, which are, I think, quite familiar across Latin America in general. And I want to use my last minute or so to use that kind of comparison to reflect a bit on what kinds of embodied citizenships we teach in UK schools. I'm just going to give some impressions here. I'm not an expert. I am the mother of 2 secondary school students. I want to focus a little bit on actually mostly from their primary schools, from my local village school. First thing to say, I don't think we really teach school pupils how to demonstrate, right? We don't take them out on street demonstrations. Maybe we should. I do, however, think we teach other potentially relevant things in this idea, such as persuasive letters. I remember when my sons were doing their SATs, they had to write persuasive letters. This is on the model of writing to your MP or writing to your councillor. It's definitely a mechanism for representative democracy. We teach them committees because of the school council. I remember my son got put on his school's green committee at the age of 5, and I thought, my goodness, he's getting introduced to committee life, which is sometimes sort of the bane of my kind of professional life. But you know, it's a form of political action. It's really important. It's also representative. And I think in the classrooms, from what I see, I've been impressed by how effectively pupils are taught small group work, teamwork, and collaboration. And I think I'm not quite sure exactly how this maps to citizenship and democratic education, but I think it's important. There will, I'm sure, be others. What I'd like to conclude with is a call to think about citizenship expansively as the kinds of political action we engage in and are permitted to engage in. And citizenship is therefore embodied. Crucially, that embodiment includes voice amongst other aspects of experience. And we should also consider the kinds of voicing and the kinds of embodiment that are taught and that are made possible and that we can push to make possible. For me, this expansive version of citizenship works quite well as a basis for activism for democracy. The demand for full citizenship, full participation, is potentially quite powerful. At least it is in the constitutional regimes of Latin America, but I think it could be quite powerful too in the UK. It just demands that we question and also assert what kind of democracy we have and what kind of democracy we want to have.
Mr. Donovan? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was up late last night thinking what I'm going to say about it. And I think I'm just going to speak from the heart. So excuse me if I start crying. So up until about 5 years ago, I was working in early help, which, if you don't know, is kind of like universal services where there's like low-level concerns about a family or young person. And I did that for about 8 years. Prior to that, I was in working with young people in the youth justice system. So when we receive referrals in the early help, often the language that was used was concerns around gang affiliation and disruptive behaviour, and the young person's been disrespectful. And when we kind of unpick that with the schools, it could be something like they kiss their teeth, which is disrespectful, but we would never, ever get a referral that says, oh, the young person sighed heavily, which is like an alternative. So over the years, it kind of really became frustrating because language is so, so powerful. And what we saw happening over time was that schools clearly did not want anybody who was going to push against the boundaries, who's going to say, no, actually, I don't agree with that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. So then a narrative was created about that young person because they didn't follow the rules. And what we tried to support the schools to think about was every young person's context is very different. So I'm a mother myself, and I know that I've sent my children to school, not saying, you know, make sure you listen, make sure you've got all your pens and pencils and don't get a detention. I've said, remember chicken shop grooming, you know, don't be too loud. I'm having to teach my son his rights in case he gets stopped by the police. So if you think about being a 12 or 13-year-old young person going to school, and you've got to remember your pens and pencils, you've got to remember to do your homework, but you've also got to remember, oh, if I walk down that way, there might be this happening, or, you know, if I say this to this teacher, they might take it the wrong way. Like you have to suppress your emotions. You can't be openly frustrated. And I think when young people get into that situation and a narrative is created about them, and then they start to get detentions and start to get put on report, then they start to get excluded, and it's one exclusion, it's two exclusions, and okay, now you're so disruptive, you're gonna affect everybody else's learning, so we can't have you in our school anymore. We're gonna send you to an alternative provision. And when I first started the job, I thought, oh, an alternative provision, it's small, it's therapeutic, it's, you know, gonna be helpful, and that was not the case. That was really not the case. And then a narrative gets created and a culture is then created within that institution. And unfortunately, it does seem that young people don't have great outcomes once they've entered that system. So if you think you're part of a school community and you're a citizen of that community, but you're now being shut out, you're being, you know, labeled, you're being victimized, you're being excluded from participating, from being with your peers, from going on trips. Now you're being excluded from this community. So you've gone to this alternative provision, and then it's like, okay, well, you can't do all of your GCSEs, so you can only do a small amount. And everybody says, you need your GCSEs and you need this many to go this place. And now your world is shrinking around you. And it's like, how can we encourage young people? I 100% agree that GCSEs are important, but it's not everybody's, you know, it's not everybody's flavour, to be honest. So how do we create opportunities for young people to express themselves in a safe space? You're entitled to feel frustrated. And you shouldn't be penalised for that. And it, like, being part of a system that feels very oppressive and trying to make change is really, really difficult for me. You know, I'm a social worker now, and I went to school the other day, and the young person has been out of a maths lesson for 4 weeks because the teacher decided the meeting with his mum was not successful because the mum asked a question that he couldn't answer. So he decided, okay, well, the meeting was successful, your child can't come back to the class. So when I went into the school and I explored that, he went back into class straight away, and I was like, well, actually, you've just brushed over that you're in the wrong, and an apology needs to be had, and there needs to be a resolution, because if the shoe was on the other foot, you wouldn't just brush over it like this. And it's trying to find the balance of, yes, there are school policies, and yes, there are things that young people need to do, but also schools need to hold themselves accountable. And I feel like, you know, as a parent who's had some battles with the school about, you know, resources to provide additional support for my children. You know, there's no funding, or there's no this and there's no that. I give you a very painful example. In primary school, there was a family that we used to travel on the bus with, and they was under special guardianship, and the granddad was, you know, giving me a real story. And because of my work, I said, oh, you know, you can ask the school for this thing and whatever. That happened on a Monday, and I'm a parent governor. And for 3 years prior to that, I'd been asking for support for my child. I can't, there's nothing we can do, you know, really stretched. So that conversation happened on the Monday. The Thursday, we had a governor's meeting. And, you know, the young person came up, and even though we don't talk about names, I knew who it was. Oh, we've managed to get funding for this. And I know that what they needed was 3 or 4 times more than what I needed in terms of money. And it was, you know, I really battled with myself, like, how do I continue to believe in and want to be part of this when actually my child is, you know, not able to access education fully because the resources apparently aren't there. And I think about all the parents who are are afraid to speak up, don't know how to speak up, don't know the support, don't know the education system. And it, goes right back to what is their relationship with education? How have they felt excluded? And we can talk about generational trauma. My mum definitely said to me, you've got to work 10 times harder. And it's not something that I say to my children, even though it sits in the back of my mind all the time. You've got to watch your P's and Q's. You can't do this. I just want to be myself, and I want my children to be themselves, and I want them to feel safe wherever they go to do that. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But with everybody sitting in this room and beyond, I just hope that we can start to make shifts and changes so that everybody can feel safe in all spaces that they're in.
Thanks. All the talks we've had so far have been so brilliant and really speak, I hope, to the theme I'm going to talk about today. So my starting point is I'm talking more about mental health really than education directly. But if education is going to be inclusive and equitable, it needs to look after mental health, both in a preventative way and in a responsive way. The challenge is, how do we know which strategies are going to work for mental health, which strategies should get government backing or commissioning backing or resource backing? And the answer that's usually given is, well, we follow the data. What we need is good mental health data. And from that, decisions will be made that are fair and equitable about doing the best good we can with the resources we have. But today I'm going to talk about data equity. Data equity means using data in a way that's aware of bias, discrimination, and power. And it also means using data in a way that has an ethos towards trying to advance equity of health and well-being for all of the population. So successive government policies, really since the 90s, have emphasised a need for more and better mental health data, and particularly outcome data for the sorts of interventions that might work. But this data is notoriously hard to collect. For example, the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, some of the top researchers working on this are based there, and they've described youth mental health data as FUPS. It's an acronym for flawed, uncertain, proximate, and sparse. They come up with that definition after a programme some of you are probably aware of, a CAMHS programme called IAPT, and there was a children and young persons version. And one of the key aims of this programme was to increase the amount of data that's collected so that we can see what's working. The programme had aims of 90% collection of before and after measures. But amongst the children who completed care, I'll pause there because we know that's not as many children as attended one session, but amongst the children who completed care, only 21% ended up with a before and after measure. So decisions have to be made on this 21% data about what works and what doesn't. And my concern is that those whose needs are already the most marginalised are least likely to feature within the data collected. So why is this? The usual answers that are given are that service providers need more incentivisation, more audit or more training to basically get the data collected. But I think ethnographic research, so for those who don't know, that means spending time watching things play out in kind of real time. I think ethnographic research can really help to shed light on what's happening with this outcome data by watching what happens when people try to collect outcome data with young people with mental health problems. And I think what's happening is the research methods that are being proposed are idealising the problem. And they would work fine for a cohort that weren't as complex or challenged by the systems they're in as they really are. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about a couple of examples from my research in a couple of places: equine-assisted therapies, animal-assisted alternative education, and green social prescribing. But I'm going to kind of lump them in because there really are some resonating themes. In all of those arenas, service providers feel that it's critically important that they improve their data strategy. It's something they feel quite anxious about because funding follows the data. But they're finding it challenging to get the data in at the numbers that are being requested by funders and referrers. So there's a lot of reasons why it's so challenging, particularly for diverse cohorts. But a couple of the reasons I'm going to talk about today. One is an outcome measure works on the premise that we can take a before measurement of something, usually filling in a psychometric test, and an after measurement. In order to take a before measurement, we need young people who are willing to be measured. regardless of what the measure is, they have to be willing at least to sit down at a time that is convenient with a piece of paper, put pen to paper and put their thoughts down authentically. That just isn't representative of cohorts who've had a challenging time at school and don't come looking at an assessment in a benign or neutral way, but come with all sorts of embodied responses to what it means to write down your thoughts on a piece of paper and send them off to be assessed. So we start out with that, the before measures are challenging, that getting a before measure is already a sign of having influence over a young person, for good or for worse. And then we have that the psychometric tests they're being asked to fill in just aren't appropriate for all cohorts. And that's because the validation processes, validation is a term I'm not going to get into now, but validation processes are what make these scientifically usable tests. Where do they take place? In schools. So very few psychometric tests are tested for populations who are actually excluded from or struggling within schools. For example, some of the items on wellbeing measures that I saw used ask young people to rate from 1 to 5, how true is it that I always tell the truth? Other items that I've seen include, I like everybody I have met, I value getting a good education, and my favourite, I always share my sweets. These are tests which, surprisingly, young people don't always acquiesce to fill in. And they find ways of resisting filling in the measures, measuring themselves inauthentically, or measuring themselves kind of deceptively. One of the things I saw was young people ticking all 5, which I take as saying, I don't need your help. I'm not engaging in this conversation. Interestingly, thinking of Shan's talk, I guess this is a type of resistance which doesn't get represented because the data set just loses that resistance against the form of measurement. So the data is capturing a more idealistic concept of needs. Young people as honest, open, articulate, trusting, with a positive relationship with paperwork and the authorities in the room, willing to make a change about themselves as though that is the problem, and subscribing to the ideals within the scale. And the big concern for me is that even services that don't agree with the remits of the measures have to compete with one another to present a better version of this idealistic concept of a fixable problem in order to get funding to support the young people that can't be measured. The worrying thing is, if the money follows the data, it's going to be harder and harder to play that game.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. As Kelly mentioned, I work on educational inclusion and exclusion, and my reflections are going to be more academic than personal. It is through my research and the research of my research group that I've come across a multitude of ways in which educational inclusion and exclusion can intersect with the cultivation of citizenship values, and in particular, how marginalized learners feel a sense of belonging with their state and their communities. It is this sense of belonging that I want to focus on today. And by that, I mean that feeling of security, feeling secure and at home, but also feeling recognized and understood. And there are 2 processes that I particularly witnessed in my research and that of my group. And one is feelings of productivity, and the second is shared sense of identity. So my work at the Faculty of Education involved an evaluation of this massive project funded by FCDO called the Girls Education Challenge. It's operating in 17 countries, 41 projects. And I particularly focused on 3 countries, Nepal, Malawi, Uganda, to see how these educational projects were impacting the lives of girls with disabilities. So in our evaluation, we did not just look at educational outcomes. We also saw, what were the sense of belonging that the girls had with their communities. And interestingly, the girls who were receiving vocational training skills spoke about how they now felt like they were a bigger part of the community. They spoke about how they were able to resist dependency. They had a purposeful activity, and they felt that the attitudes and interactions with the community members had changed. So I have one quote from one of the girls in Nepal who said, "I can weave doormats, table mats, and make necklaces. I can sell and get money to support myself and my parents. Now the community respects me." Parents similarly also spoke about how the attitudes of community members had changed and how they also felt more like they belonged in the community as well as their girls. But this newfound belonging, however, raises an important question for our discussion here. Must marginalized individuals and girls become economically productive to feel like they belong in their communities. Another aspect of this came from a research of my supervisor, Professor Nidhi Singhal, who did some research in India with women with disabilities. And then over there, the women with disabilities had certain responsibilities at home, for imbibing traditional gender roles of cooking and cleaning. But they took so much pride in being providers and carers for their family, and they felt this is, how they feel like they belong because they are the providers for their family, which I thought was really interesting. And Nidhi also spoke about how notions of belonging and citizenship can be readdressed through social cultural aspects of participation. But again, I would like to ask this question: is participation necessary to feel like you belong? Another aspect of belonging came from my PhD research, which focused on the role of religion in education in Pakistan. To give context, I am from Pakistan, and Pakistan was made on the notion of the two nation theory, which said that Hindus and Muslims of the subcontinent, due to their distinct identity of separate religious communities, needed a religious separate homelands. It was created for Muslims, but it was also created as a haven for religious minorities. Today, 97% of the population is Muslim, but we have 3% minorities, including Christians. And religion is literally ensconced in the whole society, with it being involved in the politics, education, media. So I went into the schools, including a church administered school, to just look at how religion was involved in the classrooms, what were teachers talking about. And there were various points where teachers would, irrespective of textbook content, teachers would speak about why Pakistan was created in the first place, especially in the church administered school. And here I have a quote from a teacher. I asked her, why did you mention it? What was the need for mentioning the division between Hindus and Muslims and the creation of Pakistan when there was no textbook content? And she said, it is students' duty as citizens of Pakistan to know that we needed freedom to practice our religion, and we were now not getting along with Hindus. So although this was a church administered school with Christian teachers and students, the term us was often used by relating the persecution faced by Muslims by Hindus. And the self, importantly in this context, the self was heavily constructed as the self was Muslim and Christian and the other was Hindus. Another teacher said, it is important for students to realize that we are similar to Muslims. We all believe in one God, and that is why we belong in this state. Here, shared symbolism between Muslims and Christians, because of their relationship as sister religions as well, was seen as an important mechanism to foster belonging with the state for the minority religious denomination. Students were in turn also encouraged to underline their religiosity and their loyalty and allegiance towards the state, and talk about how, again, reiterate the identity of the nation and talk about why the nation was created in the first place and how we are loyal towards our Muslim brothers and sisters. So while researching on different forms of marginalization, I have come across one common thread: the link between active engagement and citizenship. Now, that active engagement was in the form of educational and economic participation for girls with disabilities. On the other hand, it was also in the form of reiterating allegiance and loyalty towards the state for minority religious denominations in Pakistan. What both threads had in common was a desire to belong. In constructing an imagined community of citizens, certain markers of shared identity, and this includes language, ethnicity, religion, caste, they're often emphasized through education. And that is inevitable. Education and citizenship education would also entail that students will be taught about their responsibilities towards the state. But my reflection on this, or rather a question that I have for everyone, is that how then can education prevent these markers of identity from creating exclusionary citizenship and a sense of belonging with the state? And how then can education be used to foster a sense of belonging in the students that does not require them to constantly reiterate their loyalty towards the state or reiterate the fact that they are productive and they're doing something for the state? And rather than having a reflection on this, I would love to have a conversation on this afterwards. And that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you so much.
Now, I'm not going to get it wrong this time. Alex Barton-Turner.
Hi everyone, my name's Alex, I'm 20 years old. I was a bit upset when I saw you walk into the room, so I thought I'd be the youngest person here. Glad to see I can still bring the average age down. I'm here on this panel today because of an article I wrote for this university student newspaper. I talked about my personal experiences with youth violence, and I was very lucky enough that our organizer here read it. I'm very privileged that I can speak about maybe some more anecdotal stuff to the academic stuff we've had. So I attended a large state school near where I live in Peckham, South London, which the Daily Mail described as just a few minutes walk from the prestigious Dulwich College. Unfortunately, it was talking about this in the context of a stabbing. Two boys, one of whom were critically injured, were attacked in my assembly hall just before lessons finished at the end of the day. This was in my second month of school there. And in fact, if my secondary education began with a stabbing, it ended with one too. So I myself was stabbed twice on my first day of year 13 in a robbery or a G-check gone wrong. And I think it's a truth of growing up in certain areas, especially of London, but in this country, that violence is an ever-present background force, and that this manifests itself in young people as a sense of constant vigilance. So this is a vigilance that manifests itself in many ways. So I'm talking specifically about youth violence, and that primarily involves young men. And after being attacked, I spoke to many of them, people that I'd grown up with, worked with, just to try and find a way to anchor what I was feeling among the experiences of others. So first, where I'm from, the idea of youth violence is completely normal. So between the ages of 13 and 18, when one is small enough not to be able to fight back, but not so small that it's undignified to be robbed, all of the boys I know would probably be stopped about at least once a month, and that would often develop into a violent confrontation. What I'm really trying to drive home today is that this is not caused by a denial of service, so government services, but is down to a denial of citizenship. So the people who are being drawn into these kind of vicious cycles are typically separated from other young people. And there's an understanding that while the benefits, the kind of voice, the power that living in this country has for some people, they do not have it. But all of the legal ramifications of making small mistakes can mount up, and these do apply. So the boy who stabbed the two other boys in my first month of school had been internally excluded for bringing in weapons previously to defend himself from bullies. In my secondary school, this meant he had been sent to a separate building while still in the institution, off-site, which had barred windows, large classes, and where pupils could be sent. I knew one person in year 7 who was sent there for the rest of his time at school. So they were denied not just from education, but from participating in the social fabric of being young, of being around other children. When I speak to other young men who have been stabbed or have carried knives to protect themselves, they bring up the same things again and again as the root causes. So that's the decimation of our youth clubs under Tory austerity, the degradation of community feeling in our cities as things like cooperative kitchens are replaced with food banks, the actions of gangs which suck in children as young as 11 with promises of money and belonging that they don't have, just to turn them into county line drug mules, and of course, the ever-present racism in the police service, which turns a force that is supposed to protect people into an enemy. So a pizza delivery co-worker of mine, so someone I used to work with, who described himself as mixed race, told me a story about when he was stabbed, when he was flashed in the face by a white man who was mentally ill. When the police officers arrived, he was held as the suspect, and he was asked if it was gang-related. If the races had been reversed, it would have gone far differently. Now, I'm interested in policy, and I was actually very heartened, so I'll very briefly talk about here, is that the Labour Party's knife crime action plan that they put on their website is actually a very good workable policy. So, for example, to deal with some of these root issues. So, for example, I spoke to a youth violence charity called Red Thread, and they say that the main aim is to reach young men the day they enter hospital after an attack, and to use the shock as the jolt needed to push them out of gangs and into rehabilitation. Now, in the Labour Party's policy, it wants to put youth workers in A&E units, custody centres and pupil referral units, as well as dedicated mental health professionals in schools, as a way of kind of bringing people out at the source rather than waiting for things to develop further. So these are all progressive policies which I think show great promise in tackling the root causes of urban youth violence, which successive Conservative governments have ignored for far too long. However, on this matter, the Labour Party has got its messaging wrong. Its communication policy is wrong. It has led with its push to ban zombie knives, which are already illegal in the UK, and is making a very big deal about how it will implement tougher sentences for those found carrying knives. Now, these are not attempts to fix the problem, but to make a grand political statement by focusing on a highly visible issue while avoiding the structural causes. So it's much like the Conservatives' current immigration obsession, the Rwanda scheme. The thing is, beneath the scaremongering, Labour has a genuinely workable policy. It is just an indictment of a political climate that has become so poisoned by a Thatcherite conflation of harsh punishment with justice that it cannot be proud of it. It's attempting to court Tory voters with a red rag of tough on crime rhetoric, while its political messaging counteracts what needs to be done on the strategic side. Youth violence needs to be treated as a public health problem, not as a crime problem. Even the term knife crime has become politicized, which is why I'm using the term youth violence in this speech. Knife crime implies criminals which must be punished and excluded from society. In reality, all of the people involved in youth violence are victims. These are children killing children because there is nowhere else to go, and the only weapons they can get their hands on are kitchen knives. So, 3 months after I was stabbed, I sat in a Labour council-run restorative justice programme across from one of the 3 boys who had attacked me. He had been caught stealing a motorbike, and the police had found my zip card in his pocket. He was small, he was younger than me, and he was miserable. He told me about the impact of his arrest on his mother and how he had just been in the wrong time, in the wrong place, with the wrong person. And the thing is, I believed him. I felt sorry for him, and I had to try and force myself to remember that, as the ward nurse on shift at the time had said, if the knife had gone any deeper, I would have bled out from a burst artery. Now, the boy spoke as if what happened wasn't his fault, and at the end of the day, I believe him. He was not a violent criminal, but someone with no hope for his future. Labour's policy plan that they're setting forward is a step in the right direction, but its rhetoric does not match reality. We cannot afford to keep up a policy of exclusion, to ignore the build-up of decay until it surrounds us completely. Our culture valorizes wealth and power, but systemically denies it from certain groups. And we act surprised when models like Andrew Tate or gangs spread out to plug the gap and glamorize the violence that already exists for so many young people. What we must do instead is bring people in through communication, education, and a truly inclusive model of citizenship. Thank you very much.
It's certainly not least. Lindsay Ruffy.
Thank you. So let's start with the provocation. What's the provocation? So I'm going to start by saying I think the British education system is discriminatory. And I say that both as a practitioner, a teacher for 18 years, a head teacher for part of that time, but also somebody like you who went to school, because isn't that something we've all got in common? The law says that actually we can't have schools that are discriminatory in any way at all. And that actually we should have schools that are completely committed to inclusive practice. Some of you in this room today, I'm sure, are educators. And I hope that you sit here thinking, not me, she's not talking about me. My practice is inclusive and I welcome all my students and understand their individual nature, their needs. I want to have those needs met. But sadly, too many times in too many of our schools across whole swathes of our community, students are left not having their needs met. We'd be right to assume that the intention of education systems is that actually there is inclusive practice, that it does focus on the individual, and that in fact it does create really great citizens who go on to see their lives thriving. In my part of East London, just going to give you some general statistics, 5 in 10 children are eligible for free school meals. 4 in 10 children have additional needs identified already in primary school. 6 in 10 are often find themselves, 6 in 10 of all excluded children come from the global majority. And 7 in 10 of all child protection referrals will have an element of domestic abuse at the heart of that referral. So that just gives you a sense of who we're dealing with in our classrooms and the sorts of issues that those young people are facing. And yet, as has been said a number of times here this evening, we welcome the children and young people into our schools in the morning. Our expectation is they sit down, they get out their books, they listen to people like me and others, and they learn. They might be hungry. They may have seen something that morning that is absolutely terrifying. They may be worried about a parent at home for whom they don't know whether actually by the time they get home in the evening, that parent is going to be safe. But we expect those children to learn. I myself grew up in Liverpool. I don't know if you can tell by the accent, it's been gone by now, but during Thatcher Britain that you referred to Alex in the 1980s. And I too felt, even at that very young age, that I was being discriminated against. So I definitely had issues with my reading and writing, and I was excluded from the classroom, just as you were saying, to sit outside. The expectation of who was going to support me with those challenges was not the school, not the qualified teaching staff, but my mother. My mother was going to come in and sit with me outside of the school library, and she was going to teach me to read. That expectation that actually those challenges, some of which I've described here today, are not going to be met by the education system, but in fact, somebody's going to be blamed. You're not fitting in, you're not doing what we've asked of you. This is your problem, it's not ours, has to stop. Now, there are plenty of classrooms, of schools, of colleges, of settings right across this country for whom inclusive practice is at the core of what they do. But sadly, there's not enough. And the answer to that has to lie with people like you and I who continue to stand up on behalf of those young people and make sure that we see them for who they are and not the expectation that we have as educationalists. As has been said in my short biography, I had the privilege of taking on responsibility of becoming head teacher for 2 pupil referral units. And I say that and I wince, pupil referral units. How is it that those young people, many of whom will be those young people in that cohort of free school meals, definitely been known to social care, likely to have experienced personal trauma in their lives, how is it that they are removed from a setting for which they are familiar? They have friends, they have associates, they have familiarity and comfort. How is it they are removed and placed into an organisation that is called a pupil referral unit? They don't even warrant going to a place that's called school. Is that what we're saying? Is that good enough? So when I was asked to take on the responsibility for 2 PRUs, 1 primary, 1 secondary, why was I asked? I was asked because actually they had failed their Ofsted. Ofsted had gone in, seen those young people not experiencing quality education. And instead of tackling that as the root of the issue, what they said is, this is a failing school. We need new leadership. New leadership needs to come in because these students need to sit down. They need to learn. They need to get their GCSEs. That's what those inspection reports said. So I was asked to go in and I took that opportunity, but it was patently obvious from the minute I arrived that the issue wasn't about those students sitting down to do their GCSEs. The issue was relational. It was all about the prejudice and the paradox of the fact that actually the most vulnerable children, those who had experienced such dramatic trauma in their lives and still more to come, were not being seen, were not being heard. I'm going to tell you one story about a young lady called Paige. In the secondary pupil referral unit, it was 30 places. There were 4 girls in that unit. So a problem straight away. 4 girls, 26 boys. The majority of the staff in there, teaching and non-teaching, were male. I was one of the 5, I think, female staff in the pupil referral unit. My primary school that I ran was a little way down the road. I get a call one morning saying, you must come to the secondary prune, you must come now. Paige is having a meltdown. She's throwing paint all over the art room. She's trashing the place. We need to call the police. We know you don't like us calling the police, Lindsay. So if you're not going to let us call the police, you need to come and you need to handle her. I arrived and they were correct. The art room was trashed. Paige was distraught. She was crying. She was abusive. She was aggressive. I asked the staff to leave. What was clearly happening in the period between me arriving or them ringing me and me arriving was that there was a lot of confrontation happening. So Paige was confrontational, and the adults who ought to be providing the safe space, who ought to be working with her to understand what the issues were at the right time, I'm not suggesting that was the moment to do it, were confronting her about her behaviour. There was raised voices. The anxiety that she was demonstrating was being mirrored by the adults in the room. After, and I mean an extensive amount of time, exiting the other adults, sitting, allowing Paige to show out in the way that she needed to do, I eventually had an opportunity to talk to her. And what was absolutely clear is that this was a young woman in crisis. Young people do not behave like that unless they're in crisis. If I tell you now, you will be distraught, and it still distresses me to this day. What Paige told me is that the night before she came to school, she had travelled up and down on a railway carriage where she had entered into sexual acts for money. She was 14 years of age with adults on this train while other adults watched. Up and down all night. And she gave that money to her mother because she cared and loved her mother and wanted to stay with her mother and was so anxious about being removed because her mother wouldn't be able to pay the rent that month that she was prepared to go to those lengths. She came into that school, I will call it a school because that's what it should have been called, because actually she thought that was a safe haven. And the showing out was her attempt to say, I'm in pain, I'm struggling, hear me, see me, help me. But instead of that, the norms, the paradox of the situation of saying, actually, to be judged by Ofsted, to be judged by whoever else the regulators want to say about the quality of an educational experience, you must sit down, you must partake in that lesson. You must get those GCSEs. So I say to all of you here now, and I'm sure you're here for this reason, trauma-informed practice, relational practice has to underpin our approach to education services in this country, or else we will continue to be discriminatory. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it was very one. And I'm actually going to forego the typical chair privilege of asking the first question because I know that we're limited on time. So what I wanted to encourage is that if people would like to ask questions in the room, we can take those questions first, and I will actually take 3 questions at a time. So if anyone already has something they know they would like to ask about, I would love to hear from you, or if we have any in the chat.
On the question, it's something that's not been covered particularly, that the DFE has no statistics on internal exclusion, and it's massive.
It's huge.
It's completely hidden. And I've run the DFE, seen the researchers and people that say, no, we don't keep statistics on that. Some kids can be in these internal exclusion units for days, weeks, months, and even a year. And I think it's something that we ought to bring into our debate. We don't know much about it. I've visited many pupil referral units and internal exclusion units, some of which are authoritarian, and then some are super kindly. One in Leicester, the kids had a carpeted room, they had goldfish, they had plants. It was totally supportive. Another one in a North London school was totally authoritarian. You come in, you sit, you bring your work with you and you shut up.
Mm.
And I talked to the head of this and I said, are you happy about this model? And she said, yes, why not? And I told her about the one in Leicester and she said, oh, namby-pamby. So I think that's an important area that, you know, we can't cover because there's so little evidence
So that's
on
what
it.
a lack of visibility in terms of statistics
Yes.
and a lack of parity across these different units
Absolutely.
and the kinds of self-governance within them as well. Does anyone else want to contribute along those lines? Yes, Gabus.
I think Wenzel already spoke at the beginning and said about disabled people being excluded. It really highlighted to me how there's two sides of the people who are being excluded and the people who are watching it. And then they're both learning from that experience, and that it starts to create an us and them, which carries on through society. And I see that, I see people's viewpoints about us and them, and that it becomes really entrenched. And then when that was followed up with the examples of, school children leading protests, and that being a learning thing which goes on. I mean, it should be obvious, I guess, that if you exclude people, then that's going to become something that continues and something, a behaviour that is learned. It's stories for learning, and that's where people will learn from and carry on behaving that way.
Thank you.
Can I just add to the
Yes.
school protesting? I don't know if most of you are familiar with the child queue from Prime. Actually, at my children's school, the children protested, and what happened is it circulated on social media the night before, said, everybody, we're going to do this. And I'm parent governor, and I would be irresponsible not to say this is going to happen tomorrow. And what that allowed the school to do was manage that. So they allowed the children to protest. They allowed the children to speak and sit out of class for like 2 periods. I think it was like 2 periods or something. Sorry, it was and I think for me, I thought that was really important. It did get out of hand a little bit because kids didn't want to go back to class. I think there's a lack of consistency, especially when you have academies who kind of do their own thing, hide data, or manipulate data. But I think if we can encourage more things like that are important to our young people, we can go somewhere with it.
Does anyone else want to feed in on that? Thank you. I wonder if I could just add into this. So, did someone have a hand?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Benjamin.
I think one thing that what you were saying brought to mind was the importance also of higher education and adult education in terms of trauma-informed education.
Yes.
Because trauma-informed primary school students become trauma-informed secondary school students, and then they hopefully become trauma-informed citizens. And if they've experienced trauma in their young life, that doesn't just disappear once they leave the school environment, especially if it was caused by the school environment. And so it has to keep going with them, and it has to affect how we're treating each other and what we're learning about how to treat each other.
Yeah. And in terms of trauma-informed therapies and trauma-informed pedagogies, I think actually Islington's been relatively successful. I wonder if I can ask a teacher who's sitting in this room from Islington if they might want to talk to this. But I think it's a really important thing to say that it doesn't just end with, year 12 or year 13, that actually it carries on. And a lot of the people who come to Cambridge via the widening participation programs that are in and now the foundation year, that is something that is crucial to understand about their experience and the ways in which they might then follow through in their education. And one of the things I just wanted to respond to on what Ari said, but also to Krabus's point, is that there is a total lack of equality across all of the different kinds of educational spaces in this country. And it's not just an independent versus state divide. That is certainly part of it. But the actual going into all these different schools, state schools, different areas get different amounts of money, different resources, different students get different money within individual schools. This kind of cherry picking, which places actually get the resource so that people get to thrive, is deeply problematic. And as Alex said, is systemic. It's not something that is easily glossed over by any stretch. Sorry. Yes.
I have a question. I'm not sure there are any newly qualified teachers in the room, or if anyone who works at the Institute of Education right now, because when I trained 20 years ago, there wasn't a single module on trauma-informed practice. And I wonder if that's being discussed or done in schools, because if we're contact teachers or form teachers or whatever, all of us should have some sort of knowledge about this. I'm not sure if anyone is in that space here.
You're avoiding my eye contact for a reason.
Yeah, we are. We're part of the Trauma Informed Schools movement within Islington, and we're also part of a kind of anti-exclusion kind of movement where we're really trying to reduce the amount of exclusion that's going on. The thing that I've been kind of mulling over, kind of listening to, there are a couple of things that really resonated, especially from what Alex was saying about how all the people involved in youth violence are victims and things like that, and actually tying it in with public policy and people like, the media and the Labour Party kind of picking up from that, wanting to essentially other the perpetrators of violence, wanting to create this us and them divide between the perpetrators and the victims of violence, and not wanting to see that we are actually all in the same place and we all have to share the same space. I guess the question that's on my mind is, how do we communicate to, I guess, people in the general public or parents who perhaps aren't represented in this room, who are saying, I need my child to feel safe in the school, and they kind of coming to me saying, how is my child going to be safe when this kid who has been bringing weapons in, has been perpetrating instances of violence or abuse or whatever, is then being brought into the classroom? How do we, and I believe that is the right thing to do. I don't want them to be excluded. They need to be brought in. But how can we kind of hone that message to people who perhaps aren't already on the page that we're on at the moment, if that makes sense? It's going to be a difficult message to kind of get across.
And as a parent, that's a hard thing to hear as well, right? And if we're being honest about that, the parents in the room and then the non-parents, when you're in a space where someone has perpetrated a violent act before, whatever the reason behind that, it is frightening. So it's kind of also dealing with that fear as well. But you're right, it's a shared space. Alex.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I think with these things, I think you're right to focus on the parent being worried, because I think children tend to not really to think about these things differently. So when it comes to punishments, especially in relation to in schools, for example, talking about that boy who was bringing weapons in because he was fearful of bullies, I think that the idea of having a punishment tied to some kind of therapeutic or social justice thing and then reintegrating back into the school would be much more accepted by his classmates than probably by the parents of those classmates. I think, especially in school where the whole idea of punishment is explaining something to an authority figure and then being placed back in that room, for classmates or for people of that age, that is seen as how punishments work, and that wouldn't create fear. I think that obviously in any situation there will be children where a lot more work has to be done because of things happening at home, and in that case that you might have to take them out of school for a while, but they should always be encouraged to incorporate with other young people. And I think the real problem, what you were saying about internal exclusions, how it goes up to a year, it can go far longer than that. It can go, so in my school, there was someone who, I can't remember what they did, but was in my year, in year 7 for about 2 months, and then were never seen again. Were on registers still, were on rotas, but was sent to this internal exclusion thing. And because their behavior worsened when they were there, they never left it. And that is a cycle that continues. And basically at some point, we're going to have to allow parents to be a bit scared to break it, rather than just keeping it going continually, and I think that's probably the way forward.
Sean.
So I was just kind of thinking about obviously lots of people in here very expert about kind of specific kind of interventions and practice and so on. But I also think there's also this wider problem of how we imagine ourselves in society and how we think about democracy, which is that we're getting pitted against each other constantly. And it's not just an us and them. It's a my kid versus your kid. It's a me versus you. It's a this school gets more resource and that school doesn't, and this school needs the resource and that school doesn't. And it's this kind of struggle to, this stuff should be funded properly. I mean, I'm thinking, I was listening to Alex, I've got to say, I was listening to Alex and, about the kind of the policy proposals, and I'm thinking, yeah, but the Labour government's not going to pay for that. I mean, we know, excuse me for being cynical, but I mean, but there's this notion of this kind of scarcity within society. And so I'm not totally sure how we particularly combat that other than by kind of joining together with a kind of an expansive sort of claim for and demand for democracy, for actually kind of things to work well for everybody. Yeah.
There's a few online. Okay. Anna's going to give us some questions from online.
Yeah, a few different questions. Some of them speak to things that have already been said in the room, but I'll kind of run through them. So Jasmine from Full Scope is asking how we support the Department for Education to understand the changes needed to ensure that all children and young people get the education, become part of the community, and support them to achieve their potential. Someone else willing to share a report with you that I'll share with you afterwards. Another kind of comment speaking, I think, to some of the conversation about the role of teacher training and how this, the role this has played in the relationships between children, people and exclusions. And the last one here on the rise of, saying the rise of ideologically driven zero tolerance educational approaches in some multi-academy is notably pronounced even locally in Cambridgeshire. From an inclusion perspective, it's certainly having impact on traumatizing and re-traumatizing, especially those who are neurodiverse. I say this as a CEO that runs a social enterprise engaging with youth who are excluded officially or unofficially.
Thank you. I was going to ask, do you want to speak to how the Faculty of Education contends with some of these shifts in practice that are needed? Because I feel like there is an awareness, but I wonder if you would have a deeper understanding.
So I was just listening to all of these conversations, and a lot of the work that the Faculty of Education does is outside of the UK actually, and in a lot of the global South context. But specifically talking about teacher training, there is a lot of focus in the faculty on how teachers are the most important determinants of student experiences inside schools and how they need to be focused on. That means T-service and in-service teacher training. That is gender, sexuality, disability, inclusive. But in a lot of contexts, the problem is that, and that's something that we're working on, that there aren't enough resources and the teachers feel that they're overworked, overburdened, and they do not have the kind of support that is required to kind of deal with these issues. Is there anything else in particular that, kind of interventions that you want me to speak about?
Can I just add to that? Because I kind of agree. I think the stories we tell for those of us who are in and around education are really important. And I think my daughter's just about to start teacher training in September or October, I am not going to be telling her it's hard. I'm not going to be saying there's not enough resource. I'm going to be saying, you are going to be a fabulous teacher. You're going to be compassionate. You're going to be kind. You're going to see those students for who they are. That's what, and I think it's really, really important that we do that, because we will pit even our new fledgling teachers into a situation where they start to, grapple around for resources even within their own institutions. So I think we just have to start telling a different story about the resource situation. It's not getting better anytime soon.
Yes, Helen.
I would like to share some thoughts that have arisen from a book that I read recently. I'm sure many of you have read Radical Inclusion by the Education Minister from Sierra Leone, David Munyama. And many things in that book resonate with what I've heard tonight. But one in particular was that change needs courage. And that feels to me quite striking, because I do think we've had many courageous speeches this evening, and that would give me hope as well.
Thank you for that. I mean, one of the things I think is really important, and it's present in this room right now, and it's present to a certain extent downstairs when we go downstairs in just a few moments to have a much needed drink in some of our cases and some crisps as well. Is that a lot of it is about diversifying the voices that actually get listened to. And so that is what the project for the exhibition, the Anthropology by Children project, actually, on which Adam and his class worked with me. And that's a really good example, because that was a group of children, special educational needs, disabilities, neurodiversities, going through different kinds of transitions in life spaces, for whom they are very well provided. I don't want to embarrass Adam, but he goes well out of his way, from getting additional chickens for the garden to on his holiday with his own children, to setting up a lunch club where children who find it difficult to be in those larger spaces because of their neurodiversities or for other reasons, or because of being bullied, have a special place to go with a guinea pig. They don't wash their hands before they eat sandwiches. Just saying. Other than that, it's wonderful. But I think it's very important that we think about how often we actually get to hear perspectives from young people who are still at secondary school, or who have just left secondary school, who actually know a lot more about what it is to be a young person as they are young people. And I think it's also very important to get the teachers who are out there struggling, because there are teachers out there struggling, or who are thriving, or whoever's working in these spaces, to be part of this conversation. I'm conscious that we are exactly on time right now. I'd like to end there and hope we can carry on the conversation downstairs, but I'd like to thank our speakers and all of you for coming today. Thank you so much for this.